New York City has always been a mirror of the future, a place where cultural shifts appear first before spreading outward, and in 2025, one of the most striking transformations unfolding quietly across its streets is spiritual rather than technological, a shift not announced by church bells or religious banners, but by the low hum of espresso machines, and the soft murmur of conversations in cafes, bookstores, and shared spaces. Because something profound is happening here. Spirituality is moving from formal religious buildings into informal, human-centered environments. Not because faith has died, but because the way people seek meaning has changed. Walk through Manhattan, Brooklyn, or Queens today, and you will still find historic churches, synagogues, mosques, and temples. But you will also find small groups discussing purpose over coffee, people meditating in corner cafes, Bible studies happening around wooden tables instead of pews, interfaith discussions hosted in community coffee shops, and young adults who would never identify as religious, openly talking about God, truth, suffering, and hope, in places that feel safe, neutral, and familiar. The data supports what the streets reveal. Traditional religious affiliation in America has declined over the last 2 decades, yet the hunger for spirituality, community, and moral grounding has not disappeared. In fact, surveys consistently show that a growing number of Americans, especially younger generations in cities like NYC, identify as spiritual but not religious, a phrase that signals not rejection of transcendence, but rejection of institutions perceived as rigid, political, or disconnected from everyday human experience. New York amplifies this reality because it is fast, expensive, isolating, and diverse all at once. A city where loneliness is common, even among crowds, and where people crave spaces that allow them to slow down, be seen, and belong without being judged or labeled. And cafes have unintentionally become some of the most powerful community spaces in this environment because they are accessible, familiar, and non-threatening, offering a third place between home and work where conversation flows naturally, and identity is not immediately questioned. This is why spiritual conversations now happen more easily over coffee than under stained glass. Because the modern urban seeker often distrusts institutions but trusts relationships, and cafes are built for relationships, not hierarchy. Interestingly, this shift does not mean churches are empty or irrelevant. Rather, many are adapting, decentralizing, and extending beyond their walls, experimenting with what some call café church models, or micro-gatherings where faith is discussed rather than preached, explored rather than imposed, and lived rather than performed, reflecting a broader cultural move away from spectacle toward authenticity. In these spaces, sermons are replaced by dialogue, dogma by questions, and attendance by participation. And for many New Yorkers, this feels more honest and emotionally safe than traditional services, especially for those who have experienced religious trauma, exclusion, or intellectual dissonance. At the same time, spirituality in NYC's cafes is not limited to Christianity. Meditation circles, mindfulness discussions, Sufi poetry readings, Jewish study groups, philosophical salons, and interfaith meets all coexist within the same cultural ecosystem, revealing a city that is not less spiritual but more pluralistic, where people borrow language, practices, and insights across traditions while searching for coherence in a fragmented world. This blending is not accidental but driven by real pressures. Rising mental health struggles, burnout culture, economic stress, climate anxiety, and the erosion of trust in large institutions, all of which push individuals to seek grounding, meaning, and moral clarity in smaller, more intimate spaces. The cafe becomes a modern sanctuary not because it is sacred by design, but because it facilitates presence, listening, and vulnerability, the very conditions spirituality requires to grow. Critics argue that this trend waters down faith, turning religion into lifestyle or self-help, and there is truth in that concern, because without structure, tradition, and accountability, spirituality can become shallow or purely individualistic. Yet history shows that faith has always adapted its forms to survive changing cultures, from house churches in early Christianity to underground mosques and synagogues during times of persecution. And today's cafe gatherings are simply another iteration of that survival instinct. What makes NYC's spiritual shift particularly significant in 2025 is that it reflects a broader philosophical tension. Modern people still ask ancient questions about suffering, purpose, death, and God, but they resist answers delivered through authority alone. They want logic, empathy, lived example, and freedom to wrestle, and cafes allow that wrestling to happen publicly without shame. In many ways, this movement exposes a deeper truth about contemporary spirituality. Belief today is less about inherited identity and more about chosen meaning, less about obligation and more about resonance, and while this makes faith more fragile, it also makes it more sincere. From a sociological perspective, the rise of cafe-based spiritual engagement aligns with the decline of institutional trust across society, not only in religion but in politics, media, and corporations, as people increasingly rely on peer networks and small communities for truth and support, and spiritual life follows the same pattern. For NYC, a city built on immigration and reinvention, this evolution feels almost inevitable, because spirituality here has always been shaped by adaptation, survival, and dialogue rather than uniformity. The danger, however, lies in mistaking comfort for truth, in confusing safe conversation with transformative conviction. And this is where the future of this movement remains uncertain. Will cafe spirituality deepen into disciplined belief and ethical commitments, or remain a soft refuge from discomfort, offering warmth without direction? That question is still unfolding. But what is clear is that the sacred-secular divide is dissolving, and spaces once considered ordinary are becoming arenas for ultimate questions. In 2025, a New Yorker may encounter God not through a sermon but through a conversation, not through ritual but through reflection, not through obligation but through curiosity. And whether one sees this as progress or loss depends on how one defines faith itself. Is faith primarily about institutions preserving truth, or about humans seeking it? Nick's Cafés suggests the latter is winning the moment. From church to cafe, the spiritual frontier of New York is not abandoning belief but renegotiating how belief is discovered, shared and lived in a city that refuses to slow down but is quietly learning to listen one cup of coffee at a time.